Welcome to the St. John Vianney Center's podcast series, Journey to Thrive. In this podcast, Dr. Don Marks addresses the topic of conflict transformation. Let's listen as he explains the possibility of adopting a mindful perspective with compassionate strategies that embrace relational complexities, active listening, and the exchange of dialogue towards mutual benefit.
I want to suggest that just to get the ball rolling, that we think about conflict transformation as a way of seeing a situation, how we see a situation. Typically when we have conflict, we see a situation that we characterize as a problem. And, we want to acknowledge that that is perhaps inevitable, but at the same time, we kind of want to consider that there might be some other things of great importance going on in the situation where there's conflict. We're interested in how we're seeing the immediate situation, the underlying pattern and context for the conflict, and I want to talk about how conflict forms a little bit, which I think will help us understand how to respond to it differently. And then we also want to consider that we have an opportunity to see the conceptual framework in which the problem is described, right? That any situation we have an opportunity to see the situation and also to see the way that we've conceptualized the situation. So it sounds a little abstract, but I think I can put that into some concrete terms for you. I think that the best way to conceive of conflict transformation is to consider a difference in the guiding question. So oftentimes when we talk about conflict resolution, we're talking about how we're going to get to an end state where the conflict is no more. And we might think about that end state as peace, as though okay, we're going to get past conflict and we're going to get to peace, a kind of peaceful resolution. And that is lovely and important. And it's also a kind of predisposition to insist upon an end state. Conflict transformation suggests that perhaps if we're not careful, we might try to force the issue of resolution too quickly. And so we ask this broader question, and that is, how do we move our relationships, including the relationship that we're conceptualizing as a problem right now? How do we move that in the direction of peace, right? So it's a question that we're asking rather than a resolution. A lot of times we have a problem when two people are at conflict or there's one person in conflict with a larger community. What we quickly run to is how people are supposed to act. Okay, how can I make this person act right in this circumstance? And what we're talking about here is a different perspective that considers how the conflict came about, and also then how we might move the relationship that we have with that person or the relationship that we have with a group or community of people. How can we move that in the direction of peace? So you're probably getting the idea, and this table, I'm not going to labor through the whole thing because I think it probably becomes pretty clear pretty quickly that conflict resolution is focused on an end state. How do we end something that we don't desire? Conflict transformation, by contrast, emphasizes how do I turn something destructive into something constructive? Rather than focusing on the content of the problem is usually what comes up for us in conflict. And we'll talk a little bit about how that happens. Rather than focusing on the content of the problem, I'm going to focus on the relationship. My goal is not just to achieve an agreement, but rather to promote a constructive change process that might make it possible for the people, the parties in conflict, to relate differently going forward. And in this way, we're looking at larger processes and larger systems, right, when we're talking about conflict transformation, rather than just the immediate situation around the conflict. With conflict resolution, typically our horizon is pretty short term. We're just thinking about okay, how do I get this situation to resolve peacefully as quickly as possible? With conflict transformation, we tend to take a longer term view. Like, okay, not only how do I get this situation to resolve, but how do I change the ongoing dynamic of this relationship so that I'm less likely to find myself here again, right? Um, and in this way, interestingly, the conflict becomes important. So the view of the conflict in sort of traditional conflict resolution is conflict is bad, conflict is the problem. Let's not be in conflict. In conflict transformation, we consider that the conflict is part of a dynamic, and an escalation of a conflict is part of a dynamic that is important and has information in it. And that process is how we're going to get to constructive change. So we're not viewing the conflict as somehow intrinsically bad or the problem. Right? So it's a little different than the traditional way that we think about these things. With any conflict, anytime we have a conflict, there's a personal dimension to it, right? That we take things to heart. Generally, when we're at the point where we're in conflict with someone, there's something that we care about, and we're experiencing as a kind of personal distress. So when we think about transformation, one of the things that we want to do in transforming conflict is alleviate suffering at the personal level. Conflict, by definition, is also relational. And if we can have a deeper understanding of a person or group with whom we have conflict, we can actually enrich the relationship. So we have this potential also in conflict transformation. And we can keep going with this. We can see that there are structural dimensions to conflict. They may have to do, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit, they may have to do with the hierarchical power relations in a given situation. And there may be opportunities to transform structurally our relations with others because of things that we learn from conflict. And then finally, as we'll see, there are also cultural patterns to conflict, and there are cultural strategies for responding constructively to conflict. I think our faith tradition provides us with really powerful cultural ways of responding constructively. And I'll talk about this in terms of evoking compassion. So the big shift here between conflict resolution and conflict transformation is that instead of concerning ourselves with what the conflict is about, what we're shifting ourselves to is how we relate to others. So we consider that the starting points for conflict transformation are compassion for self and others, a dialogical orientation. I want to have an ongoing conversation with you about something, right? And the content of that conversation is secondary to the way that we're having the conversation and to the relational nature of the conversation. Just going to dive in for a few brief minutes here into what it is that brings patterns of conflict about. Conflict tends to unfold according to patterns, and many of those patterns have a history. So I want to kind of share with you a little bit about what psychologists understand regarding the development of conflicts. There's a very influential paper, I should say book, by a man named Jerry Patterson. It came out in the 80s. That I found very helpful in understanding some of the origins of conflict. And perhaps maybe it's the bias of psychologists, but we do tend to think about things having their origins in our families of origin. And one of the things that Jerry Patterson identified were patterns of conflict in families that recur. And he identified the processes that lead them to recur. So I just want to kind of go through this for a minute. He was looking at specifically families where there was a fair amount of conflict and aggression, and where there were children who were having all kinds of problems with conflict, both in the home and outside the home. today we might talk about diagnosing people who he was talking about with ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, right? But I think that there's something in what he described that's more important than a label or a diagnosis. What he noticed was that the children that were having a problem with aggression typically had families where conflict was handled with coercion. And so when people were in conflict, what would happen in the family was a kind of ongoing coercive attempt to get one person to come around and agree with other people's point of view, or more or less to submit. And teasing, criticizing, needling, ridiculing, all these kinds of things were used in those family settings to pull the person into alignment, into agreement. And what would happen, he found, in these families was that that process of coercive manipulation would continue to the point where somebody would just basically lose their temper. Somebody would shout, slam a door, strike someone, or storm out of the room, and that would cause others to back off. That was the only thing that would sort of break the circuit of coercive needling, right? And what Patterson recognized is that the backing off after the explosion, the aggressive behavior, whatever it was, even if it was just shouting or slamming a door, the backing off after that happened reinforced the process. So it reinforced the shouting or the slamming doors or the running out. And so it was really the rupture of relationship that kept the pattern of conflict going. Now, in a different context, some years later, a very influential marriage and family therapist, John Gottman, identified pretty similar dynamics in marital relationships. He talked about what he called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in a marital relationship. And those were this pattern of criticism, defensiveness, stonewalling, and contempt, a kind of reciprocal hostility that would escalate until aggression or separation occurs. Unfortunately, when that pattern begins, at the point where one person backs off, it reinforces everything that happened up to that point. So we're often in the throes of these kinds of patterns of conflict, where we're in the midst of escalation, driving it to a breaking point. When the breaking point occurs, it actually reinforces the participation in the escalation. And it does that through a process of negative reinforcement, that the parties involved feel relief once the blow up occurs. Paul Gilbert, very influential psychologist who wrote this book, The Compassionate Mind. I highly recommend it, The Compassionate Mind. Gilbert was actually knighted for his work in psychology. He's British. He talks about these 3 dimensions, 3 functional dimensions of the human person. There's kind of a acquisitive dimension, there's a threat-focused dimension, and there's an affiliative dimension or a safety-seeking dimension. And these patterns of criticism and defensiveness, of coercion and escalation that characterize conflict, those, I want to say, keep us in the threat-focused area. They keep us in the protection and safety-seeking area. And the problem with that is that there's a high price to be paid for staying in that area, both relationally and physiologically. It's very activating, but it's also immunosuppressive. It's stressful. It has a number of different unpleasant consequences associated with it. And it also has a tendency to be self-perpetuating. One of the big problems that we see, and you may have seen this in your own life experience, is that when people stay in that threat-focused domain for too long, they begin to avoid doing things that give them opportunities for positive reinforcement. So if I'm very threat-focused, maybe I'm concerned about how people are going to treat me, I'm concerned about how I'll be labeled, or I'm worried about whether people will be welcoming or critical toward me, I may pull back from social activity. When I pull back from social activity, I'm not going to get the opportunities for positive reinforcement that I would normally get. I'm not going to get the opportunities for the soothing affiliative dimension of the human person to be evoked. I'm just going to kind of find myself feeling less and less involved, more withdrawn, more potentially hopeless. And when I fear, when I stay in that threat detection mode and I fear that I'll be met with criticism or rejection, that's going to keep me separate. It's going to lead me to avoid encounters with people in my community because I'm trying to avoid some unpleasantness, some unpleasant situation. So that means that when I don't go to a meeting, or I don't show up for prayer, or I don't, go to work, or whatever it is, I actually feel a little bit of relief because I've avoided this unpleasantness. But the downside of that is that I've also avoided any opportunity for reinforcement, for good things to happen in my life. And so I'm very susceptible to depression now. This process is also what we could consider the basis for what people have termed institutional violence. And you may have heard these terms. These are very widely used terms in the professional, in the psychological literature about the helping professions, about other, areas as well, other domains as well, but particularly about the helping professions, that there's a possibility when conflict is ruling the day, or people are alienated from those who are in positions of authority relative to them, or people in authority alienated from those who are in their care, in their charge, we consider that to be vertical violence. Vertical violence is a rupturing of the service relationship, we could say. And the service relationship, by the way, is the service that the person in leadership provides, right? So it ruptures the service that the person in leadership provides in this case. And then we can also have a rupture that's collegial, and we can have that pattern that we were just describing of negative reinforcement, avoidance, maybe escalation leading to conflict. That can happen between peers, and we could see that as a rupture in the collegial relationship. And so our goal in conflict transformation is to use a compassionate, relationship-centered approach to conflict to heal those breaks, those ruptures that we might see as problems for anger, violence, conflict in communities. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now on this compassionate alternative. One of the things that we've learned about human beings, and it's actually kind of surprising that it took psychology as long as it did to figure this out, because I think our faith tradition had figured it out a couple of thousand years ago. But it took psychology a little bit longer to get the picture, that everything that we've learned about human beings says that we all need a nurturing environment, that is absolutely critical to our well-being. And the characteristics of a nurturing environment are those that promote and reinforce pro-social behavior. So community, gentleness, kindness, acceptance, these kinds of things, we absolutely need those in order to thrive. We have to minimize socially and biologically toxic conditions, right? So those coercive kinds of interactions where people are, picking at each other or needling each other, those are both socially and biologically toxic. And so we've got to work to minimize those. We have to set limits on exploitative behaviors and at the same time minimize aversive control. What I mean by aversive control there is a lot of rules with a lot of punishments associated with them. We tend to do better when interacting with each other is rewarding than if interacting with each other is a way of avoiding punishment, right? That seems to kind of go awry. So we have to kind of minimize those aversive control approaches. And we want to be flexible and pragmatic in our pursuit of whatever it is that we share together, right? Our reason for working together. And be flexible about that. These cooperative relationships, I think, are the fundamental component of conflict transformation. So the first step, if we want to consider steps in this process of resolving an ongoing conflict, is going to be reconnection. It's the only way that we're going to get to something that's cooperative and transformative. And I'm going to talk about some very specific skills that could be relevant in how we do this and how we build a kind of foundation for empathic communication and how we can focus on taking care of one another in these circumstances. That's going to be, critical to getting that nurturing community in place. What I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, the alternative to the threat-focused approach, the alternative to the let's get out of conflict as quick as possible because it scares us all approach is actually a kind of ongoing relationship where we're kind, gentle, and nurturing with each other, right? That this is, I want to suggest to you, and I don't mean this to sound like really rigid in saying it, because I'm very flexible about how we might do this. And at the same time, I want to say it's the only way. The other way isn't going to work. The way of saying, stop that, or kind of putting down rules and punishments, it will work temporarily, but then it will cease to work, and it will likely perpetuate the problem. This way that I think we're outlining here in conflict transformation is about the only way that will keep the problem from returning, because it transforms the context. I just want to highlight something too. I want to highlight this because it's very important to understand that this need for cooperation, this need for nurturing community, is very deeply organismically part of humans and all created beings. Like all the beings in creation appear to have this characteristic to some degree. And one of my favorite examples of this is the cooperation in chickens. There's a wonderful study. It was done by a man named William Muir, who's a researcher, ironically, at Purdue University, where he studies chickens. And he is interested in this problem. It's a fascinating problem. If you're interested in chickens, he studies this problem of how do you get chickens to produce the most eggs. Most industrial chicken farming is done where chickens are kept in pens of usually like 9 to 12 chickens. And he is interested in this question: do I get the most productive chickens by finding the chickens that are most productive and having them reproduce, or do I get the most productive group of chickens and have them reproduce? And so what he found was he took pens of 9 chickens, and he picked the chickens that were best and had them reproduce, and then he picked the pens of 9 chickens that were best at laying eggs and had them reproduce. What he found was when he had the chickens that laid the most eggs reproduce, what he got after 3 generations was that top picture, which was a pen with only 3 live chickens in it, and none of them had any feathers because they basically pecked each other to death. That's what he got when he put together and bred the most productive chickens. When he bred the most productive pen of chickens, group of 9 chickens, in 3 generations, he had 9 healthy chickens, and the chickens laid a lot of eggs. The pen of chickens laid a lot of eggs. What he found in this process, it's a very interesting process. What he found in this process is that in the pen of 9 chickens that lays a lot of eggs, the healthy chickens after 3 generations, 4 or 5 of the chickens in those pens laid no eggs at all. They were helper chickens. Right? They were helper chickens. My advice to you in conflict transformation is become a helper chicken. Becoming a helper chicken is the most important thing we can do. We all flourish in this context where what we're doing is creating the nurturing conditions. If we're all trying to be superstars, if we're all trying to be the shine forth as the most successful, we actually make it impossible for anyone to do that. And we're, as human beings, we're wonderfully suited for this. One of the things that's a fascinating dimension of human beings, which you could say is that same thing as that affiliative dimension, is as the system which we're hardwired to experience, that almost nobody ever talks about, and that's the tend and befriend system. You've probably heard of the fight or flight system. Maybe you've heard of the rest and digest system, but we also have, as a basis of our biological being, a tend and befriend system. It's mediated by oxytocin and vasopressin. It's a part of the stress response. Anytime you experience stress, you also have the potential to evoke your tend and befriend system. And there's a great health psychologist, Shelley Taylor, who wrote a book on this called The Tending Instinct. How do we do this? How do we become, if you will, helper chickens? How do we evoke our tend and befriend process? One of the things that we have to do is recognize the ways that we've been socialized away or out of these important dimensions of the human person. There's probably no greater source of conflict and tension than the way that we've learned to argue. And most of us learned this from very early on in life. We learned that the way to argue, the way to demonstrate knowledge about the world, and even the way to acquire new knowledge about the world was through debate. And so I want to suggest to you that there is something, unfortunately, as nice as some of the outcomes of debate have been, there is something unfortunately toxic about debate. And part of the problem with debate is that it's a win-lose proposition. And you'll notice this about the conflicts that arise in your community. They'll have this win-lose dimension to them. And that is characteristic of this human engagement that we've kind of been socialized in to debate. When we debate with other people, we look for the flaws in their argument. We try to critique their side of the story as distorted or wrong or invalid. Typically, the more we debate, the more hardened we become in our own stance toward the problem. We make assumptions about the other person's position. We make assumptions about their behavior, why they're behaving the way they are. We think about the other person as raw, and we'll often feel very strong emotions, like anger, and use them in ways that are geared towards highlighting the wrongness of the other person. I want to suggest that that probably is the number one contributor to the difficulties we have with conflict, is this kind of socialization to debate. And so the alternative is really dialogue. What is dialogue? Well, dialogue is about understanding where the other person is coming from. That rather than convince the other person that they're wrong, what I want to do is understand how the other person came to think what they think. How did they come to believe what they believe? And would they be willing to hear what I believe and how I came to believe what I believe? And that changes the dynamic entirely, because I'm assuming from the get-go that the person's views are valid, that they came to what it is that they believe through their experience, and that is valid. Even if it's not ultimately what's going to be workable in terms of transformation, it is valid to begin with. Right? So this is this important distinction between debate and dialogue. The next thing that I want to stress is the importance of understanding anger. One of the problems that we often have with anger totally makes sense, of course, but anger evokes our defensiveness. When somebody's angry at us, we almost immediately start to justify ourselves or to become defensive. And and I'm not saying that that doesn't make sense or that shouldn't happen. But what I am saying is that when we do that and only that, we miss something. And what we miss is that the angry person is suffering. I think it's very useful to remember that the word anger, our English word anger, it's the same root word as anxiety and angst. It's fear, right? And it comes from the Latin word angor, which is anguish or suffering. And so we can remind ourselves when a person is angry that that person is suffering. That really anger is a manifestation of suffering. And then we can begin to understand that we're not going to respond effectively to the person by using anger in response. What do we do in response? Well, the key thing in response is to maintain the connection. So how do we maintain the connection? Well, one thing is that we've got to make it clear to the person who we're in conflict with, or the parties who are in conflict, that we care about them, that the care is present. So that means, some of the things that we tend to do when we're defensive are probably not going to work very well. The folded arms, the refusal to make eye contact, the very quick and summary dismissals, some of the things that happen between people when there's conflict, like eye rolling, scowling, inappropriate smiles, sighing in exasperation. Those things all contribute to the kind of rupture of the relationship and unfortunately perpetuate the conflict. So we have to be cognizant of that if we want to do conflict transformation. The other thing that we really need to do is choose our words wisely in these circumstances. And one thing that I think would be probably clear to you already, but I kind of want to emphasize it, is that when people are angry, the form of suffering that anger takes is a response to threat. Anger is a response to threat. And so when we're angry, we're particularly sensitive to things that we might perceive as invalidating. So it's really critical not to make accusations in the context of anger. So if I say to somebody, well, you made a mistake, right? That's really not going to be the most conducive thing to keeping the relationship going. So it might be more useful to say something like, it's important that we follow the procedure so we can safely manage these situations. I know it's cumbersome at times, and it's important that we do it. Again, when a person is particularly sensitive to threat, we have to be careful about using second person. It's a good idea, if we can, to say I rather than you. Instead of, you're confusing me. The way you're talking is confusing me. We might instead say, I'm confused, right? So those are just some examples of the importance of choosing words wisely. If we can avoid giving orders, that can be helpful. Instead of telling people what they have to do in the midst of their suffering, say, it might be best or it would be best if you. And then offering help, taking responsibility and offering help. I'd really like to help. Let me see what I can do. Now, these kinds of strategies, I think, are often very beneficial. And I'll share with you some more of these kinds of tips. But I think you probably get the idea from these suggestions that we're talking about ways of maintaining relationship. That the most sort of long-term beneficial way of proceeding with conflict is to maintain the relationship and understand the suffering of the person who is angry. And that's going to work best if we're not eliciting defensiveness and reactivity. So I have a number of these tips. And I'll tell you, I actually got these tips, variations on them. Before I was a psychologist, I worked in the corporate world. I was a director of marketing for Fortune 500 software company. And I got these tips from these situations that I was in the corporate world. One thing I have to say, this is one of the most immensely helpful things you can do, is apologize. People get really concerned about apologizing often. And the thing they get concerned about is, well, if I say I'm sorry, that means somehow I'm at fault. I apologize for the situation. I think that is a really, really helpful thing to do, because when people are angry, they're looking for some sense of understanding. And I'm sorry that this has been so difficult. I'm sorry that the situation is like it is a very different thing from saying, I'm sorry I did this to you. That's, that we'll often not want to say I'm sorry because the implication is that, and we can be sorry for the situation. So it's a very helpful thing. I also want to talk about some things that we can do individually in our own experience. And so one of the things to recognize is that when conflict shows up, almost all of us are going to be kind of thrown back to earlier times in our lives when we experience conflict. And those memories are likely to be emotionally charged. So one of the things that can be very helpful to do is to tell ourselves at those times, that was then and this is now. The thoughts that I'm having are thoughts about the situation. They're not facts. And I can disentangle from the emotions. I don't have to be how I feel. My emotions are not who I am. And we can go even broader than that, and we can recognize, and you might recognize this about yourself at this very moment, that you as a human person are miraculously and infinitely spacious. And so it is possible as a human person to make room. We can consider that we're larger than any given experience that we might be having, whether that's a thought, an emotion, content of a situation, whatever it is, we're larger than that. And so it's possible for us in an almost oceanic way to make room for whatever arises. And I want to conclude here. I want to conclude with a couple of thoughts. So there's this quote from Saint Therese that I really like, and I find this helpful to me when I'm in situations with conflict. And I remember I said at the beginning that the issue with conflict transformation is not the what. It's not what the conflict's about. It's the how. It's really the how. How do I want to relate to this person in this situation? And so I love this quote from Saint Therese. The value of a life does not depend upon the place we occupy. It depends upon the way we occupy that place. I want to conclude with this last thing if I can. This is a Zen saying, and it's very helpful to remember, especially when you're encountering some anger from people. And that is, beneath anger, fear, beneath fear, grief. Because we're in our fear, we fear what we might lose. Beneath fear, grief. Beneath grief, love. There's only grief when we love. Beneath grief, love. And beneath love, the clear blue sky. Beneath anger, fear. Beneath fear, grief. Beneath grief, love. Beneath love, the clear blue sky.
We hope you found this podcast on conflict transformation helpful. You can tune in to our full podcast series, Journey to Thrive, on our website at sjvcenter.org. Click on resources or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you and God bless.